28 and 29, going into the progressive presidents. That's what we're going to hit today. I love the progressive presidents, so hopefully y'all are going to too. First one we're going to talk about today is going to be Theodore Roosevelt. So we've talked about him before. We're going to jump back into it now and talk about the progressive side of his administration. So first up, again, Theodore Roosevelt is one of the most interesting personalities of the 20th century. I mean, there's never been a politician quite like him. He was our youngest ever president. He comes into the presidency in 1901 after. So Teddy Roosevelt was our youngest ever president. Now, one thing that's important to understand about Teddy Roosevelt is he is what we call a patrician. That means he's someone who comes from wealth, extreme wealth. The Roosevelts are a very, very wealthy family. However, he still believes he has an obligation to help with those less fortunate. And that's going to be important to understanding Roosevelt's commitment to the progressive causes. Another important facet of Roosevelt to wrestle with is he is obsessed with this idea of manliness. Roosevelt overcame all kinds of childhood disabilities and health issues, and that obsession with manliness is going to manifest itself into his foreign policy, especially toward Latin America, but his domestic policies as well. Now, Roosevelt is a progressive, but he's also a conservative. Remember, progressives don't all agree on the same thing. He's a conservative because he wants change to be orderly, to be gradual, not super fast. We don't want too much radical change right away. Remember, that's what the populists want beforehand. That's one of the reasons they failed. Progressives want a slower order of change. Some of them, Roosevelt included, wants a slower period of change. So again, he was imperialist abroad, but he has a soft streak for the progressives back home. First big event that's going to show off Roosevelt's progressive streak is going to be the coal strike of 1902. Big time coal strike in Pennsylvania. So there's about 140,000 coal miners that go on strike for better conditions, better pay, safer environment, the usual reasons that workers go on strike. The owners are going to refuse to negotiate, won't meet with them at all. So now the country starts going into a coal shortage. Factories, schools, even hospitals start to run out of coal. Therefore, people get cold and people start being very nervous about what's going to happen. It does get cold in a lot of parts of the United States. Roosevelt is going to decide to step in. So he wants a solution. He's going to call representatives from both sides, labor and the owners, to the White House. And he's annoyed at what he calls the stupidity of the mine owners because they refuse to negotiate. So he's going to actually side with labor. He's going to threaten to take over the mines and run them with the federal troops, meaning using his big government authority against the mines. This is the very first time that the government has threatened to use force against the owners of capital instead of against the labor. So the coal miners in that situation are going to kind of give up, and they're going to agree to arbitration. Now, Roosevelt is going to be known for what we call the square deal. Square deal, the saying, just basically means fair. Everyone gets a fair shot. Roosevelt is going to be known for what we call the square deal. And what that means, the square deal is a saying, it just meant fair. Everyone gets a fair shot. His plan really includes 3 C's: control of the corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. We're going to talk about all of those in more detail in just a second. First up, let's talk about the corporations. So the first C of our 3 C's. Roosevelt is a big believer in we need to correct our companies, not destroy them. Remember, he's not a populist. He doesn't want to bring down all the companies. Companies are good. There are some good trusts out there, but there are also some bad trusts. If trusts stay within the law and they serve the public, then good. Roosevelt thinks they should be there and they should keep helping out. However, if a trust goes beyond the law and starts taking advantage of people so people can't get that square deal, then he wants to use the government power to step in. But again, he doesn't want to destroy the company because he knows how important they are for the economy. Now, Roosevelt realizes early on to do this, he's going to need stronger government powers, the Interstate Commerce Commission was inadequate to take care of this. So about 1903, Congress is going to agree and start passing legislation that Roosevelt needs, giving him the powers to control the corporations. Now, the first thing they're going to come up with is the Department of Commerce and Labor. So Commerce and Labor, what that department's going to do is basically deal with strikes, kind of like the coal mining strike. They're going to mediate between the two sides, get them to come together, try to come to some peaceful resolution, that everyone keeps working and business doesn't stop. The economy won't slow down. Also in 1903, we're going to get the Elkins Act, which is going to put in big fines for giving out or accepting rebates. So that's going to affect the railroad industry. Again, the railroad industry is going to be the dominant industry that we're going to talk about pretty much in this unit. Even more important than the Elkins Act, though, for controlling corporations is going to be the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act is going to be passed in 1906. It's going to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission. Remember, the ICC is kind of inadequate, or they were inadequate. This gives them more powers to take on these big trusts. And it's not really important for our purposes that you know exactly how. Now, Roosevelt, he gets a reputation for being a trust buster. And how he starts getting this reputation starts in 1902 with a case against the railroad holding company, Northern Securities. Now, this is a huge railroad company. It's owned by J.P. Morgan, and it is enormous. I mean, it badly needs restraint. J.P. Morgan and his investors own about 2/3 of all the U.S. railroads. It is by definition a monopoly. Roosevelt says they have to divest, they have to break up into smaller companies. They say no, setting up a clash between Roosevelt, who creates this idea of the powerful president, versus the big, powerful trusts. So we're going to see who is going to win. The Supreme Court is going to side with Roosevelt, and they say the company has to break up. It is a monopoly. This is the very first time a president has ever successfully applied the Sherman Antitrust Act to a big trust. Big time. First time the government intervention of this sort. This is going to make Roosevelt super popular with the American public, and it shows that he's a really good politician. He was able to sense that that's what the people really wanted. He makes that a priority as soon as he steps in, right after McKinley is assassinated, and the people are going to feed into that. He's going to be super popular right away. Now, he's not going to stop just with that railroad company. He's going to go on and brings 44 cases against trusts, breaking up several of those. Now, again, you got to remember Roosevelt, he would rather not take down companies. If he can get them to operate under the law, he will do that. He only kind of brings it to court as a last resort. And that's going to be a pretty big difference between Taft, who we're going to talk about after we get through with Roosevelt. So just one difference to keep in mind. Another big example, or another difference to keep in mind, besides the willingness to use the courts to break up the trusts, is this idea of the strong president and strong leadership. Roosevelt embodies this strong president. He's arguably our strongest president up to this point. His successor, Taft, is going to be very different. Now, at the end of Roosevelt's run, again, he's not really interested in breaking up these corporations. So a lot of the trusts are actually healthier than they ever were. Several of them, by divesting, actually become more successful because the company was too huge, it wasn't efficient anymore, and this makes them more nimble and agile and able to even make more money. And Roosevelt is fine with that. He just wants to bring them in and make them operate under the law. Now, even though Roosevelt gets the reputation as our big trust-busting president, Taft is actually, in fact, going to break up way more trusts than Roosevelt ever did. But we'll talk about that when we get to Taft later on. So that's our first C. That's control for the corporations. Let's jump down now to consumer protection. Now, as you can imagine, this means protecting your everyday consumer. This comes out of one of the exercises we did in class when we talked about the jungle. A lot of the food coming out of America is not safe. Some European countries are banning American meat because the meat is contaminated or they've sent over meat, like canned meat, and it's just been gross and spoiled, and they opened it in Europe. Now that threatens American companies. If Europe all out bans meat, it's huge industries that'll go down, lots of tax revenue that'll never get to the federal government. So the jungle, right around the same time, is going to make a lot of people aware of this issue, make them demand for change, even though the jungle is not supposed to be about, or not supposed to focus on the meat aspect of it. It's supposed to be about the working conditions. The food is what people really latch onto and start to get upset about. So Teddy Roosevelt is going to get Congress to pass what we call the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, and it says that all meat, any meat shipped over state lines, has to be is subject to inspection, meaning the federal government can say it has to meet a certain standard. After that, we're going to get the Pure Food and Drug Act, also in 1906, and that's designed to prevent the mislabeling or adulteration of foods and pharmaceuticals. You have to have pure foods. You can't have half chicken and half squirrel or raccoon or something crazy. You want to be able to know what's in your food, what's in your drugs. And these acts are still around today. This is why when you go to the grocery store, you can try to get grade A beef, grade B beef, all that kind of stuff. So the government thinks there is an interest in the consumer to know what they're eating and protect them from companies. The last C for Roosevelt's Square Deal is going to be conservation of natural resources. So basically protecting the earth. Americans at this point are destroying the environment at a rapid pace. There's been some attempt at slowing down the pace of destruction with past laws, but nothing has been super effective, and nothing's been to the scale of what Teddy Roosevelt is going to do. Teddy Roosevelt was a naturalist. He was a rancher. He loves the outdoors. He spent a lot of time out in the Badlands and the Dakotas, and he is appalled by the destruction of resources. All the trees being cut down, all the land eroding. It's bad news. So he's going to build irrigation projects out in the western states. The Roosevelt Dam in Arizona is going to be named after him. And several other similar projects all over the western states happen in the next few decades because of the push Roosevelt makes for conservation. He also wants to save the forests. By 1900, we've actually only have a quarter of the forests that we used to have from before the Europeans got here. So we need to try to save what we have. He's going to save 125 million acres. How can you do that? He's going to declare them national parks. By declaring something a national park, private companies, logging companies can't go in and cut down all the trees. So the lumberjacks have to go somewhere else. So he's going to save 125 million acres of land by creating it national parks. He's also just symbolically going to ban Christmas trees in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt hated Christmas trees because it's just killing a tree for no reason. Now, Roosevelt, again, is not against using natural resources. Because remember, he's for business, and a lot of businesses require raw materials. But he is going to be for using them responsibly and not stripping us of natural resources. So it's trying to find this balance between greedy commercial interests and romantic naturalists. He's somewhere in the middle in there. So now we're done with Teddy's 3 C's, and let's move on and talk about an election. I love a good election. How about the election of 1908? Now, we're going to skip 1904 because boring election. Roosevelt wins easily. He's super popular. I mean, it was silly for anyone to even run against him, especially William Jennings Bryan, who just loses professionally. But 1908 is a fascinating one. So, Roosevelt has only been elected to one term. He won in He won in 1904. Let's go back up. So the election of 1908 is interesting. Roosevelt won 1904 easily. He didn't win in 1900 because you remember McKinley was the top of the ticket. But McKinley was killed so early into his administration, Roosevelt has practically served 2 full terms. And the whole idea was no president should serve more than 2 terms in a row. So Roosevelt announces he is not going to run in 1908. Again, if he would have won easily, but he's promised beforehand and probably kind of instantly regretted it. He's not going to serve more than 2 terms. He doesn't want to break the precedent set by George Washington and followed by all the presidents since, to be that first guy who runs for 3 terms. Now again, it's not in the Constitution yet. You can't serve more than 2 terms. It's just been a precedent that's been followed. So Roosevelt now gets to pick basically his handcrafted successor. He can pick anybody. Anyone that he points to and says, this is my guy, that's the guy who's going to win, because Roosevelt's that popular. He's a kingmaker. He can do anything he wants. And who he picks is going to be a guy named William Howard Taft. He was a Secretary of War under Roosevelt, and he's also a mild progressive. So he's going to win the nomination easily. Then he's going to go on to face William Jennings Bryan in the election. And if William Jennings Bryan is ever running, you know what's going to happen. He will lose, Taft will win. So Taft ends up winning the election of 1908. So the most interesting thing about this election to me in 1908 is the socialist candidate actually does very well. Eugene Debs is going to get almost 500,000 votes. So there's a fairly strong socialist element in the United States at this point that doesn't get much attention in your textbooks or in other sources. Now, again, if you doubt just how popular Roosevelt was in this time period, just check out our next slide. That is Mount Rushmore, the only tourist attraction or thing of note in South Dakota. It has 4 of what some people consider our greatest presidents. You should all recognize them already, but we got Washington, then we have Thomas Jefferson, Roosevelt after that, and then Abraham Lincoln on the far right. Interestingly enough about this picture, or not this picture, but the monument, Roosevelt hated Thomas Jefferson. TJ was not his favorite by far. Because remember, Thomas Jefferson was very timid, always wanted to avoid confrontation. Teddy Roosevelt sought confrontation. He was all about strong leadership. So it's ironic they ended up being molded next to each other for all of eternity. For as long as that mountain is there, those 2 presidents are stuck head to head. 2 great presidents in their own respect, but very different. And Roosevelt couldn't stand Jefferson. Jefferson never knew Roosevelt, obviously, but would not have been a fan of his if he did. So let's move out of South Dakota and get back into our slideshow. All right, let's talk about Taft a little bit. Now, your textbook calls Taft a round peg in a square hole. I think they're trying to be funny because Taft was our largest ever president. He is a huge dude. By far, our widest is probably not the correct term, but he had some girth to him. He was a large man. In fact, he was so big, when he laughed, people would call it a mirthquake because it just took over the room. So Taft had a very different personality than Roosevelt. Even though he's his hand-picked successor, they're very different. Taft was not a big personality. He would not take over a room, and he was not strong enough to hold together kind of radical fractions or factions of the Republican Party, because you have your conservative wing and your progressive wing. Roosevelt, because he's so popular and such a character, he could do it. Taft is going to struggle with that, so the party's going to split under his leadership a little bit. Also, Taft was passive instead of aggressive like Roosevelt. He tries to avoid conflict with Congress. Roosevelt would basically beat up any congressman who threatened him. One of the best ways to understand one of the differences between Taft and Roosevelt is to look at their backgrounds. Taft looks at things like a lawyer, and Taft was a brilliant legal mind. He was an excellent lawyer. He was the former Solicitor General. And if you don't know what Solicitor General means, he's the number 2 guy in the Justice Department. That's usually the guy who argues the government's case before the Supreme Court, whenever there's a Supreme Court case involving the government. He was also, again, the Secretary of War under Roosevelt. He has a very different decision-making process than Roosevelt's going to have. Taft, like a lawyer, likes to take his time. He likes to think about an issue from every different angle and come up with the best possible solution after careful consideration. Roosevelt, he has no time for that. He wants to act boldly, act quickly. He thinks about it quickly, makes a decision, and goes. He is not timid by any stretch. Some people would consider Taft's style as being timid, and timid is not the mold a lot of people like after Roosevelt. Roosevelt, as well as a excellent politician. He loved politics. He loved the competitive nature of it. He loved shaking hands and talking all day. He had an infinite supply of energy. He really was kind of like the Energizer Bunny of politics. Taft hated politics. He was much more of not a recluse, but he doesn't feed off people to give him energy the way that Roosevelt does. And when you look back at great historians, usually the ones who are better politicians, who have that outgoing personality, are more often the ones that are ranked very high compared to other ones who are not. And the last big difference to point out is Taft was a very, very honest guy. Too honest to be a politician. I don't want to disillusion any of you about the nature of politics, but if you're always going to tell the truth, you are never going to be a good politician. Hopefully that'll change. But back then, it's certainly the case. But Taft was probably too honest to ever go for the White House. Now, Taft, in terms of foreign policy, is big on this idea of dollar diplomacy. Roosevelt, remember, had big stick diplomacy. Taft is going to go with dollar diplomacy. What that means is, let's spread our influence with our money. Have American banks invest in foreign projects in foreign countries, and that's going to help American interests. Also, let's keep out foreign investment from the United States. So we will invest abroad. Let's keep foreign money out of here so we don't have to split our loyalties to anyone else. So through that policy, through Taft's policy, we're going to invest heavily in China, in the Caribbean, into Europe more and more. So dollar diplomacy is going to be pretty successful in terms of Taft wanting influence in China and Taft getting it, because American banks and Americans, private Americans, will invest so much abroad. Now, Taft is also going to be a trust buster. Taft was really the true trust buster. He's going to bring over 90 suits against trusts in his 4 years. Roosevelt brought 44 in his 7.5 years. So Taft is bringing way more suits against trusts per year than Roosevelt. His biggest one, 1911, the Supreme Court is going to order Standard Oil Company. We've talked about Standard Oil before, huge oil conglomerate owned by Rockefeller. The Supreme Court is going to order them to be dissolved into several smaller companies. Most of those still around today that are even more successful. Also in 1911, Taft is going to push for a huge antitrust case against U.S. Steel. This one is actually going to anger Roosevelt. Remember, Roosevelt, he would rather deal with things kind of in a gentlemanly agreement. Private rooms, shake hands, agree to change your policy. Taft has no room for that. He sees big trusts as bad trusts and wants to break them. And U.S. Steel is a huge one, and he wants to bring them down. And one last one that I forgot to throw on there. Taft is also going to be important for two other big things in his reign. He's going to push for two constitutional amendments, both the 16th Amendment, which allows the income tax. Remember the income tax, we haven't had one since the Civil War, really. And then the 17th Amendment, which is going to allow for direct election of senators, bringing more democracy to the people. So a common progressive cause. Both of these are going to pass after Taft leaves office, but Taft was very influential in making them happen to start with. And last but not least, Taft was once stuck in a bathtub. That's probably the only thing you'll remember about Taft when you're older. But because of that, he gets stuck in a bathtub in the White House. So he's going to have a special tub made and installed in the White House. And that tub is currently in a museum. Here is a picture of that tub, if you're curious. Now, there's also a pretty awesome picture on the internet of when the tub was actually installed and like 4 workers just sitting there hanging out. It doesn't seem as enormous as it truly is. just in this picture. Okay, let's move on out of the bathtub. Let's get into our next big election. That is the election of 1912. So after 1908, Taft is in. He's doing his thing for the next 4 years. Teddy Roosevelt is going to get out of there. He's going to go to Africa. He loved to go and shoot things when he had nothing better to do. Also, Theodore Roosevelt, he hated to be called Teddy. Theodore was only 50 when he leaves the White House. His political life has peaked when he's still a middle-aged man, when he still has plenty of years left in his life. He doesn't know what to do with himself. It's a very uncommon position to find yourself in. So he's just going to go to Africa and shoot things for the next 11 months while Taft is running the country and running the party. While Roosevelt is gone and during Taft's reign, Taft is going to split the Republican Party. The progressive wing of the Republican Party really want to bring down the protective tariff. They hate the tariff. However, the conservative wing of the Republicans like the tariff. The tariff helps protect American businesses. It ties in kind of the dollar diplomacy with that idea. So the progressives thought that Taft would side with them and bring down the tariff. However, Taft ends up siding with the conservatives. That's going to anger the progressives, and the party starts to fracture over that issue. Then he's really going to do something that's going to make Roosevelt mad when he fires a Roosevelt-appointed conservationist in the government. So now some of those lands are going to be left open, and Taft is going to promise those lands to private businesses, open them up for commercial drilling. Now that's going to make Roosevelt lose his mind. He's going to come back from Africa and be very, very upset. So Roosevelt now starts to talk about running again because Taft has abandoned what he sees as Roosevelt's policies. Roosevelt picked him out, he made him the president, and Taft has gone and ruined it. He's running away. So Roosevelt starts floating the idea to some Republican governors that if they nominated him to be the next Republican nominee for president in the election of 1912 coming up, that Roosevelt would accept it and run for a third term. Roosevelt got around this by kind of saying the two-term tradition only applies to consecutive terms. So if you take a break and go to Africa and shoot things for a while, then you're scot-free. You can jump back into it. Now, not everyone is going to like that position. There's a lot of people that say that is too far, and we're going to talk about how presidents are going to lose a lot of political capital when they try to break this two-term limit when we talk about Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, FDR. Well, sort of cousin, later on, but we'll save that for now. So there's a whole lot of yelling, and after all the Republican bickering, Taft is going to win the nomination in 1912 over Teddy Roosevelt. This makes the party officially split. So now Teddy's going to run as a third party candidate. So there'll be a Democrat, a Republican, and now Teddy will run as an independent. And a lot of people start to call his party the Bull Moose Party because Teddy Roosevelt said he felt as strong as a bull moose, which I assume is some kind of mutant moose with the strength of a bull, and maybe it's 3 times the size. I don't know. I don't think it's a real animal. So, officially the party is called the Progressive Party, but Bull Moose is what's going to stick and becomes the icon of the party. So for this election, there's actually 5 people running, but we are going to only really talk about 3 of them, and then we'll give a shout out to the guy who got 4th. Taft never really runs a campaign. He's the Republican nominee, the conservative Republican side with him, but Taft is not a politician. He doesn't have this in his blood. He was a horrible campaigner, and he was deeply affected by the things said about him on the campaign trail. Roosevelt would say mean things about him. He'd call him a fathead, call him fat, and there's actually reports that Taft would cry sometimes about this. Makes you feel really bad. So he never really puts up a spirited defense against Roosevelt. Also, this election of 1912 gives us one of my favorite Teddy Roosevelt stories. Well, at one point, he was campaigning up in Wisconsin. He was giving a speech. And some guy runs out and he shoots Teddy Roosevelt. He tries to assassinate him. Teddy Roosevelt kind of inspects the wound. He notices that he's not coughing up blood, so he knows that the bullet, which went into his chest, did not puncture his lung. After deciding that, he thinks, well, I guess it's not that bad. So he's going to continue his speech. He talks for 90 minutes after being shot in the chest, the whole time bleeding out of his shirt. And it says like it's going to take a lot more than a bullet to stop a bull moose. And the crowd is just going to lose their mind. The bullet he actually keeps in him the rest of his life. The doctors never removed it. But, I mean, that's just crazy. Who gets shot and doesn't go to the hospital right away? Just keeps on talking, bleeding from his chest. I don't know. I would go to the hospital. Now, the other part of Roosevelt's platform, on his progressive platform, besides just being able to be shot in the chest and live to tell the tale, is going to be what we're going to call New Nationalism. Now, New Nationalism is forged by a guy named Herbert Croly. You don't really need to know that. But it's going to draw from Alexander Hamilton's views on government. He wants a strong central government. He calls it centralism. So big government, government intervention. He's also going to want regulation. So the government should actively oversee businesses to keep them fair and keep them from taking advantage of the little guy. And the third part of New Nationalism is going to be social reform. Roosevelt wants to create the welfare state, even though he wouldn't call it the welfare state. That's very much what he was calling for. So this progressive platform is going to call for lots of stuff. Giving women the right to vote. It's going to try to curtail campaign spending, so taking some power away from corporations, putting it back in the hands of regular people. It's going to give workers more rights, give them the rights to unionize. It's going to limit the workday. It's going to limit the work week. It's going to defend natural resources. It's going to give federal insurance to the elderly, what's going to be created later with Social Security. It's also going to give insurance to the jobless and the sick. He calls for national health care, the very first president to ever do that. Now, you might say, this sounds radical. This is some wild stuff. Roosevelt didn't see it as being radical. Remember, he was progressive, but not a populist. Roosevelt thinks this is the only way to save America from becoming truly radical. Because also in 1912, we had the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution is actually going to get rid of the Tsar. Then another revolution a few months later with the Bolshevik takeover, go full communist. Roosevelt's very worried about that happening in the US. He thinks by having this progressive agenda, we can keep this communist revolution from coming to the United States. So in his mind, it's not that radical. It's a way of saving the capitalism we have. And while Roosevelt doesn't get a lot of these things, because Roosevelt will not win this election, a lot of those things he does push for, all will end up happening later on through the New Deal, through another Roosevelt we'll talk about later on. Now, unfortunately for Roosevelt, his opponent is going to be a guy named Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is also going to champion a lot of progressive causes, which is going to steal some votes away from Roosevelt and make him a very difficult opponent. So going into this, you know that Taft and Roosevelt are going to split the Republican vote, basically guaranteeing the Democrat is going to win the election, no matter who it is. So the Democrats are freaking out at this election. They haven't had a president in like 50 years. They've had one president since Lincoln, one Democratic president, and it was Grover Cleveland. Barely should even count. So all the major players in the Democrats want to be the nominee for the election of 1912. However, they all basically cancel each other out. They can't pick a leader that's going to carry the nomination. Woodrow Wilson is basically a political nobody. He's going to be a compromised candidate because all the other guys have too much baggage and they're all too many egos involved. So on the 46th ballot at the Democratic Convention, they're finally going to settle, and Woodrow Wilson will be the nominee. Also, because he wins the nomination, he's basically guaranteed to win the presidency. Now, Wilson's going to lay out a counter idea to New Nationalism, and his is called New Freedom. It's also going to have 3 parts. And kind of as a perfect foil, it's very influenced by, instead of Hamilton, by Thomas Jefferson's vision of America, but kind of upgraded for a new society that we find ourselves in. So New Freedom's got 3 parts and same issues. He does not want big government. Wilson thinks big government is negative. It takes away from states' rights. He also, so he wants, so the New Freedom is going to have 3 parts, and it's on the same issues. Wilson is not going to be a fan of big government. He thinks big government takes away from states' rights. So he's going to want government decentralization. Now, it's also going to call for business regulation, but Wilson views business regulation very differently than Roosevelt. He doesn't view it as nearly as strict as how Roosevelt thinks it should happen. He thinks the government should basically interfere to restore economic competition, but then they should immediately get out of there. The government shouldn't have a permanent role in regulating business in the United States. So basically, Wilson thinks the Fed's job is to watch the economy, but only step in if it's absolutely needed and then immediately pull out again. Don't stay in, don't constantly make sure that all the industries are taking care of themselves. Wilson also is going to want tariff reduction. So again, that kind of ties in. Wilson doesn't see the government's role as interfering with business. The government shouldn't be putting tariffs on anything. The businesses should be able to control their own prices. We shouldn't have to deal with tariffs. And the third area of New Freedom is going to deal with the welfare state. And Wilson is going to be total opposite of Teddy Roosevelt on this. Philanthropy is the role of private industries, of churches, of the individual. The government has no role in philanthropy or creating this welfare state. So what's going to happen in this election? Well, Roosevelt easily going to beat Taft, but Wilson is going to win the presidency, but he only gets 42% of the vote. Democrats are also going to win control of the Senate and the House, so the Democrats go from not having a president in a long time to having full control, all the keys to government all of a sudden. Now, interestingly enough, our guy Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate, last time he ran, he got 500,000 votes. This time, he's going to get over 1 million votes. So maybe Theodore Roosevelt wasn't so crazy to worry, maybe a little bit of a Russian-style Soviet takeover in the United States. So this is a crazy election. Wilson wins, but with a minority. He doesn't get over 50%, so he's going to be a minority president. Wilson won with a smaller percentage than William Jennings Bryan lost in any of the 3 times he ran for presidency. So it's hardly a mandate, but it's kind of a comfortable win for Wilson. It's just a weird way that this election unfolded, and really shows that if a party is split, one of the 2 major parties is split, unless something radical happens, the other party is usually always going to win. So what's going to happen to our losers of the election of 1912? Well, as you can imagine, Roosevelt, he's going to go back and shoot more stuff. This time he goes to South America instead of Africa. And he's going to go on a long campaign, shoot stuff. He's actually going to get really sick, but eventually he'll come back. And we'll talk about Roosevelt when he comes stateside once again. Taft is actually going to move on to something he enjoys much more than politics. He's going to go back to Yale. He's going to teach law there at the law school. Then eventually he will become a Supreme Court justice, one of the few politicians to leave the presidency and go to another government job. And he loved it. So it all kind of works out in the end for our friend Taft. Now there's a pretty good link to a video about the election of 1912 on the Haiku page. So if you are confused at all about any of these details, please check that out. Okay, let's move on now and talk a little bit about Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson. He is going to be the second Democratic president since 1861. Again, a long time since the Democrats have been in power. He was born in Virginia before the Civil War, so our last president born before the Civil War. And because of that Southern upbringing, he sympathized with the South during the Civil War. It's going to shape his views on self-determination and also states' rights. Now, Wilson's going to kind of share Jefferson's view of the faith in the masses as long as the masses are properly informed. He was a very religious person. His father was a minister. He is going to have not the most, I don't want to use progressive again, but Wilson was not a fan of equality of the races. He was a product of his upbringing and his time, and was a undeniably racist man. He did not like African Americans, did not see them as equal to whites in any way. Now, however, even with that, few presidents are ever going to accomplish nearly as much of their platform as Wilson's going to do. Wilson's platform excuse me, was called the Triple Wall. He wants to attack what he calls the triple wall of privilege in the United States. So the three walls that are kind of attacking America are the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. And we will talk about all of these in more detail soon. Now, likability. Woodrow Wilson is not going to be the most likable president. He's going to do some amazing things that we're going to talk about. He's going to have some great policies, but he also is very academic. He was the president of a university before he got into politics. He comes off as very arrogant. He doesn't have much patience for people he views as less intelligent than himself, which he viewed pretty much everyone to be. So he's not going to be the easiest guy to get along with. And it's been a few minutes, so we'll probably call it a day there. So I will see y'all later on.